Welcome to the Gritty Podcast. I am your host, Brian Call, and I am joined by my brother, the Gritty Broman. How are you, Brent?
I'm well, thank you.
Today's podcast is going to be about butchering game in the field. I have this nifty book that I got when it first came out, Stephen Ranella, The Meat Eater Cookbook.
We interrupt this podcast for this brief public service announcement.
We interrupt this program for an important news announcement.
Hello, friends. We're coming at you from the land of the free and the home of the brave. Made in America matters, so we are asking all red-blooded, true blue, red, white, and blue Americans to support one of our favorite U.S. American manufacturing companies, Leupold Optics. Just ask yourself, have you America today? If not, consider purchasing some new state-of-the-art shades from America's Leupold Optics. Support American manufacturing with a new pair of 6 shades from LeupoldShop.com. And right now, when you use the code BRIAN2020, you get a free shirt of your choice from Leupold. Might I recommend one of my favorite shirts at Leupold? This glorious American Eagle shirt, because freedom. The American spirit shines brightest when our backs are against the wall. Through wars, natural disasters, and economic collapses, we've always shown a sense of grit and ingenuity when it's needed most. It's the same self-reliant spirit Fred Leupold had when he started his Oregon-based company 113 years ago. And it's what keeps the factory performing in Oregon today. Friends, support American manufacturing, because communism sucks. Made in America matters more than ever, so we're asking all red-blooded, true blue, red and white and blue.
Red and blue.
That's right.
All joking aside, folks, we over here at Gritty love working with Leupold Optics. If you're in the market for a new spotting scope or maybe some binoculars, please consider checking out Leupold Optics. Or, if you're looking for a new pair of sunglasses for the 2020 season, check out LeupoldShop.com and use the code BRIAN2020. Links are going to be in the description. Thanks, folks. Back to the show.
I like this book. It's a great book. And in this book, there's a section on field dressing or field butchering game in the field. It's different butchering an animal on the side of a mountain in a blizzard or on the edge of a farm or hanging, rather from the rafters of a barn at a farm. The bigger the animal, like an elk, again, it's even more complicated. Or even a bear where there's just a ton of hair.
Long hair.
And bears don't, they're kind of like bean bags. They're just like loose piles of fur and meat. Like their legs aren't stiff like an elk or a deer where you can hold the hoof up and get at things. Like they're like
and they're
noodles.
Also grosser. A bear smells like a dog who's never had a bath.
Now, Brent, you have only killed and harvested bears on Prince of Wales Island. You've never done it with a mountain bear that eats blueberries in the Rockies.
That's true.
And I like the way bears smell that aren't fish bears. I think they smell great. There's I love the smell of bear. But,
really? But
bear on POW, it has kind of a skunk cabbage / rotten salmon smell to it, sort of. They have a musk. I actually even like that smell in a weird way.
Yeah, you just lost all credibility. So I was right. Bears have this stink to them.
No, they don't. Like the ones that eat blueberries, they kind of have a sweet smell.
A sweet musk.
A sweet musk, yeah. So regardless, folks, there's a lot that goes into butchering an animal. And this book is good. It breaks down with lots of photos and stuff how to do it. So it's a great reference guide on how to butcher game. I'm going to give you my 2 cents. First, I'm going to read one little fact that I think is pretty interesting that the book goes into. It says, the big buck, little buck myth. A lot of hunters have this idea that big bucks aren't that good to eat. This is nonsense. There are myriad factors that influence the palatability of a deer. Age is hardly the defining one. We put this idea to the test on a Colorado mule deer hunt when we killed 2 bucks. The first was a 3 to 4 year old giant. The second was a 1.5 year old forky. Served raw, the unanimous consensus was that the bigger and older ham was a better piece of meat. In all fairness, the older buck had been aged a day or so longer, which goes to show that factors beyond the animal's age are at play when it comes to quality meat. I would agree with that. I think that the way that you butcher your animal has a huge impact on the meat and the quality of it when you get home. How you care for the meat is critical. Now, the actual animal itself, I killed a moose. Some of you saw this video. I killed a moose in British Columbia that had a wound. And another bull moose, it appears, had stabbed it through the shoulder. And there was a wound about 18 inches long, probably, that where a bull's tine had just gone right behind the shoulder pocket there and deep into the behind the front left leg, shoulder. And the wound had healed over the top and sort of trapped in all that bacteria and infection deep in that puncture. And then as we skinned it, we saw a little hole on the outside of the hide, but it was kind of covered. It was kind of sealed up. And as soon as we cut it open, you could see there was a pretty good hole. And then once we cut into that, this pus pocket erupted.
Accidentally. You guys were cutting like 6 inches away from the hole.
Yeah. And it ended up being too close to the hole, and all this pus came out. And it's one of the worst smells I've ever experienced in my life. I don't think you're doing
it justice. All this pus, gallons. Like, imagine you have like a balloon and you stabbed it with a knife and it was full of Jello and it just all came out.
Yeah, it's like a gallon jug at least, maybe 2 gallons of pus that came out
voluntarily, and then he started squeezing it.
Yeah, like, and then there was like
pimple.
Cottage cheese type of pus in there. So there was loose pus that flowed like syrup, and then there was the pus that was like really gangrenous,
like really bad grandma gravy.
Bad. And the smell was so putrid. Like, I've smelled a lot of bad smells in my life. This was the sort of smell that really, it was really hard to suppress. You wanted to vomit. It wanted to trigger a vomit.
Well, your body knows, like, this is bad. Get away
like
from
toxic,
it.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, but you have a whole moose there, and it's like, you just killed this moose. I didn't know that it had a wound there. And so the question is what's that going to do to the meat? Mm-hmm. Now, there's a lot that you need to have your meat checked when that happens, because there could be a bloodborne pathogen of some kind, bacteria, whatnot, that's in the meat that could make you sick. So anyway, we ended up cutting up the meat and taking it home. Other parts of the moose were fine. He was walking around playing with a cow. He acted like nothing was wrong with him. That's
ungulates for you.
He didn't look like anything was wrong.
I got stabbed with a sword. What?
That had to hurt. Like,
yeah,
a gallon or two of pus behind your shoulder. That's taking up space. It's doing something. Like, when was that going to burst? Or, I don't know. Pain.
Does it burst, or does it just kind of deflate?
I'm not sure. But regardless, that meat tasted fine. But it's the hardest, toughest meat I've ever had in my life.
You'll chew on it for a good minute.
It didn't matter what cut it was. It was the chewiest, toughest meat ever. And it begs the question, like, what caused this to happen? Now, when you talk to Hank Shaw, who's been on the podcast before, and he's a wild game chef, he talks about the importance of getting to the meat and taking it off the spine before rigor mortis has set in. According to Hank, if you have an animal and you've shot it and you get over there and you pick it up and the leg is all nimble and no rigor mortis has set in, once you start cutting the leg off and the back strap and you remove the meat from it, rigor mortis hasn't had time to set in, which locks the meat down. And I don't know the biology behind this, or the chemistry, but it locks the meat down. According to Hank, so you want to get on it as quickly as possible, and you want to pull the meat off the spine before any kind of rigor mortis can take place. Mm-hmm. Now, when rigor mortis is already set in, and when you're a hunter, you walk up and you pick up the deer, and it's
cardboard.
It's frozen solid. It's cardboard. because its rigor mortis has set in. It's stiff, stiff, stiff. You can't bend a leg. You can't bend a knee. Like, it is stiff. According to Hank, the best thing to do at that point is gut the animal, hang it, and let it age, let it sit until the rigor mortis leaves and the legs become limber again and everything.
Yeah, like when they try to like gauge, like police, when they are gauging when a body, how long it's been there. Rigor mortis sets in at a certain time period and then leaves after a certain time period. So you can actually judge how long something's been dead, whether it has rigor mortis or it's past the point of rigor mortis.
That could or could not be true. I imagine there's.
I've watched so many episodes, Brian, of NCIS. You can trust me.
So, regardless, you definitely rigor mortis does leave after the animal has aged for a bit, and then, according to Hank, that's when you want to butcher it. Once you remove a leg, once you remove stuff from the nervous system, the spine, it's done. So if it's got rigor mortis set in, and then you take it off the spine, and then you let it sit, Hank was saying that will not, aging it at that won't really help it because you've already removed it from the spine. For some reason, according to Hank, it needs to be connected to the spine during the aging process in order for the rigor mortis to leave. So that's according to a renowned chef. Okay. Now, that's more or less what when I get an animal in the field, you get it however you get it. When you find it, and you skin it and clean it and butcher it as quickly as you can. But in general, in my experience, I haven't paid attention to whether rigor mortis is set in or not set in, because when I'm in the field, I don't really have an option. It just has to be done. Taken. And for the most part, I can't really tell. The meat is almost always good if I butcher it cleanly and well. In fact, the only meat I've really had that was tough, really tough, like unmanageably tough, was that wounded moose. Otherwise, pretty much I've been able to really leverage and utilize every game meat that I get, and it's very delicious. So, but there's a lot of factors that go into it. I think it's true. Some of my best elk meat I've ever had was the oldest bull I've ever killed. So age isn't really what makes meat tender or not tender. Like he said, they shot a young buck and it was tough meat, and they shot an old buck and it was the tenderer of the two. So that's not really
there's a lot of
deal.
Things. What's the word I'm thinking of? Variables.
Yeah,
that go into that.
So let me get into field butchering. So here we go. We're not going to talk about gutting necessarily. Typically, I do not gut an animal in the field.
You a gutless method guy?
I'm a gutless method guy. There's no need to gut the animal, in my opinion, especially when you're backpacked in pretty far. So let me read what is in the Meat Eater cookbook here, and then I'll expound on that. Okay. Some big game animals are much bigger than others. Bull moose can weigh more than 1,500 pounds. That's 10 times the weight of the average white-tailed deer. Hunters who kill large animals like elk and moose in the backcountry, or even a deer in a remote location, often use a field butchering method, commonly referred to as the gutless method. This means that the animal is butchered without removing the guts from the body cavity as a first step. It's particularly well suited for large animals that are difficult to maneuver. After butchering a large animal in the field, it's possible to pack manageable loads of meat back to camp or your vehicle. Okay? So let's get into what he says. Field butchering big game. Number 1, field butchering large animals is a big job. If possible, it's good to have help from some friends. That's true. In the absence of friends, I have used rope to tie up a elk leg, or, to tie, or a stick or something to hold a leg in place. But yeah, it's so much easier with just one other person. I haven't had to do it very often by myself. 2, start by opening up the hide along the back from the neck to the tail. Then begin skinning the hide toward the belly and legs. Okay? So like he said, start by opening the hide along the back from the neck to the tail. So usually what happens in the field is I'll cut an incision like right behind the head, and you go all the way down the spine to the tail. Okay. And that's your first cut. And the other cut is to skin the hide toward the belly and the legs. What you're doing is you're making that incision along the spine, and then you're skinning down toward the feet, basically, of the animal. And what that does is the animal's laying on one side, right? And so you're removing the hide, you're peeling it back from the back down to the feet. And it keeps it really clean. Keeps the hide, the hair and stuff from getting on the animal as you roll it back and peel it down the side. Okay? Does it make sense?
So when you say peeling it down, am I peeling from the spine and then peeling down towards the feet?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Because too often what a guy will do is he'll cut it up the middle, lay it on its back, and he'll try to do all this skinning that way. And it's like, no.
You actually want to start from the back, cut down the back, and then
when you say the back, from the spine of the animal. From the
spine of the animal, yeah.
Well, it's on its side. You skin, you make an incision all the way down the spine from the head to the tail, from the neck, back of the head to the tail. Then you start skinning your way.
And peeling down towards
the feet. Yep. It says, skin one entire side of the animal first. Once the hide is removed, lay it out flat, hair side down on the ground. This provides a relatively clean spot to place meat as it is removed from the animal. Okay? And you can do that. That is an option. One thing that I've done in the past and that I like to do is to bring an emergency blanket. You ever seen those, Brent?
You mean like a space blanket?
Like a space blanket. Yep.
Lay the meat on?
They're paper crochet, like light. They weigh nothing.
Yeah.
And it's nice to have just as a survival precaution. But I'll take a space blanket because there's nothing to it.
Yeah, the weight's negligible.
And I'll just lay it out on the ground, right? And then you can take your meat, and as you start skinning, you can set it right on the space blanket. You can set it on the hide as well. That's a perfectly good option as long as the hide didn't get a ton of hair on it. Sometimes the hide can, if you skin it, and you're not careful, you can get a lot of hair on the hide. But if you skin it real carefully and you skin that side and as you peel it down, you've got to make, what I end up doing typically is I'll cut around the knee. I'm good at this because I've done it so many times. And I like to use that Osborne knife from Benchmade. It's got a thick blade and it stays sharp forever. And it's that SV90 steel. And I'll take that Osborne blade and I'll just go around that knee, right through the hair and right through the bones and the ligaments right there. And as soon as I wring it, I can bend it and I can see where the joint is. And I
cut through the joint, get that leg off.
Cut through the joint and the leg pops right off. And it's the same with the back leg. And because I've done it so many times, I pretty much hit the spot just right. The back leg is the trickier of the two. Sometimes you cut too high or too low on that. Now, almost always I'm deboning the animal when I'm in the wild, unless it's a short hike out, then I'll leave it, on the leg bone. I'll leave the meat on the leg bone. Generally, I'm going to debone it though. But first, I like to pull it off in quarters. There are those who like to butcher the animal and not pull the quarters off. I hate that. I feel like you lose too much meat, you waste too much meat. What that means is instead of taking the leg off the animal, you just start cutting chunks of roast off and pieces of meat off of it. And I don't like how that's not super precision or clean. Okay. So anyway, you wring the lower half of the leg, chuck the hooves, and then when you skin that thing down on one half of the body, you just make a little incision if you want along the leg there, or you can wring the leg because you just skin it down to the bottom. And anyway, you peel it off. And then what you have is you have a hoofless front and back leg facing you, and you have the entire side of the animal without the hide on it facing you. Okay. Does that make sense? You got that visual?
Yeah, I'm envisioning an elk, and the elk is on its side, and I've now cut all of its skin off the one half and have peeled it off.
Yes.
And so I have almost like a half naked elk right there.
And it's got no hooves.
And no hooves. Yep.
So there's no hair anymore anywhere on it. And the whole time I do this, I'm very careful to not get hair on anything. I try to always peel back.
Now, why are you trying to be so anal about the hair? Because the meat's still edible, right?
I just don't like the hair on the meat, and some of the hair is connected to glands. You know, I try really hard not to touch the meat that with my hands that have been touching the glands. I try not to touch the glands. So you got your tarsal glands in the back legs and different spots. I try not to touch that. If an elk has been pissing all over his belly and having sex with cows and his whole belly is like covered in semen and funky town, like that stuff, that musky, nasty, bacteria-ridden, pissed-on area.
Picture's been painted. We don't want to touch the meat.
It shouldn't be touching the meat, right? So I'm very careful about peeling that hide back and trying not to touch all that hair.
I assume when you're doing this with
bacteria.
a friend, one of you is touching the hide all the time, and the other person's trying not to touch the hide and just touching meat.
Yeah. I mean, that's one way you can divide the labor, you know. But I find if I'm touching the inside of the hide as I curl it and pull it, I don't have to touch the hair side of the hide to pull it back. You do initially, but once you get it going, you can avoid a lot of that.
Okay.
But if I do touch it or I do get it, I'll reach in the snow, wash my hands a little bit. I'll try to get the hair off that collects on my hands. I'll try to keep my hands as clean as possible during the process. A lot of dudes wear gloves, and they say that you should wear gloves due to blood poisoning and other things. And that's up to you. I haven't used gloves hardly ever. Sometimes I bring them, sometimes I don't. It's probably better that I do, and it's nice because you have clean hands when you're done, when you take your gloves off. But I often do not wear gloves. In fact, I probably use gloves 2 out of 10 times. Anyway, you peel it back in that, now you have that animal facing you, okay? With no clothes on. The easiest piece of meat to remove is the back strap. This tender, boneless piece of meat extends from the base of the neck to the hip bones. Now remove the upward facing rear and front legs. You can remove the back straps at that point, or you can remove the rear quarters. It doesn't matter at this point. I tend to remove the rear quarter and the front quarter. And the way that I do that is, again, this takes a little bit of practice, but it's not rocket science. If you've removed, you can take that back leg and you can have your buddy hold the leg, and there's a ligament, like a little handle there. You've seen it, Brent. If you skin it right, you can hold on to that back leg, and then you just open up the hip socket there, and you just cut into the hip and around the butt. And I find that part's the most confusing part for a lot of guys who haven't ever taken a rear quarter off. But basically, you're finding the joint, the hip socket joint, and you cut that, and you cut right through that, and then you cut around the back. There's a tricky part near the bum hole where the vertebrae actually pokes in on the rump there. And a lot of guys, they get to that point, and you have to cut into the leg and then back down the vertebrae to separate that. And a lot of times they hit that roadblock, and they're like, "What? Why isn't this coming off?" Anyway, you kind of move that leg from the back, front, and you cut it off. Right? You set that down on your clean space blanket or on the hide, whatever you've got, and you have your back quarter. Same thing with the front quarter. The front quarter, you cut the front quarter off, you pull that off, and you set that down on the blanket. Okay. Then you cut the back strap off, which is quite easy to do. You just kind of follow the rib cage and the spine, and you have this giant piece of meat that comes off there. Yep. Okay. And now you have the entire side of the animal. All the meat has come off that side of the animal. Okay. He says, move your meat to the shade where it can cool off. Hanging meat in a game bag from a tree limb is ideal, but you may need to lay large heavy quarters on a bed of branches so they can stay clean. Okay, so we've done it lots of ways. You want the meat taken off. You want that, like say it's a moose. you're probably just going to lay that across some branches. Try to keep it clean, let it cool a little bit. So that's what I do. I lay my meat down, let it cool, and I move on to the next part of the animal. Putting it in the shade is smart. And then he says, bone saws are handy for large butchering jobs. Here, a saw is used to remove the entire rib rack in a single piece. You can reduce weight by deboning the rib meat, but you'll be missing out on grilled bone-in moose ribs. Okay, so some animals, I try to take the ribs, and in some states, it's required by law to take the ribs. Now, if you pull the rib meat out from between a set of ribs, that rib meat generally is going to be very useless by the time you get it home, because it's like an inch wide, and then it gets a crust on each side, and without it being on the bone, it doesn't cook well. It's harder to eat. And by the time you trim off all the hardened junk meat on the outside that was exposed to the air, you don't have much left. I mean, it's really a paltry amount of meat. And if it's harvested in that way, where you just pull the rib strips out, you can try to grind it as burger or whatever, but it's not very good. So I like to take the ribs out whole. I don't bring a bone saw, but I can cut the joint across the top and across the bottom of the ribs. There's a joint there. And if you figure out how to do that, you can cut through those joints, and then you have a set of ribs, and then you can roll those ribs into just a roll. Does it make sense?
A rib roll?
A rib roll, yeah. And then you can stuff that in your bag, and you can cook those over a fire. You can bring them back and throw them on the Traeger grill, however you like. And you saw those ribs that we ate, those bear ribs that we ate on Prince of Wales Island. Dad cooked them up in the oven there. They were good too. And I like to cook, I like ribs on the bone. I'm not going to bother taking a saw in. It's just more weight that I don't need. And I know where to cut on the joints, so I don't really need to bother with that. But that said, a lot of times I make the choice not to bring the rib meat because it's not worth it. There's not much left by the time I've pulled the meat out. And then it's not practical because I have to lay the strips out, and then they harden on the outside. And like I said, there's not much usable meat by the time you butcher it and by the time you get it home. So if you're not pulling it out on the rib cage itself, it's really tough to leverage that meat. Okay. Makes sense? Then he says, but you got to know your own game laws. Okay. Because like in Alaska, you're required to take it out. Certain states you are, like Colorado, you are not. At least last I checked. Again, you need to check your game laws, and you check them every year. Number 8, with the ribs removed, you'll have easy access to all the good stuff inside the animal. The inner tenderloins rest along the spine, above the intestines, just in front of the hips. You'll also want to save the heart, liver, tongue, and perhaps the web of caul fat that surrounds the digestive system. So there's a couple of things, like Ryan Lampers doesn't like the liver. I like the liver. I shouldn't say I like it. I think it's good for me, and so I take it and I eat it.
It's a superfood.
Yeah. It's hard for me. The testicles are the same. I bring those out. Why not? And the heart. So sometimes on certain animals, when we decide not to bring out the liver, we'll cut through the rib cage, just a couple of slices if we're not bringing the ribs out. And you can reach in, you can just grab the heart right through a broken rib. So there's no need to like pull the whole rib cage off. You just break a couple of ribs and you have a hole, and you reach in there and you grab the heart. Okay. Tenderloin, you can get at those through the top. You can just reach through without hitting the gut sac or the gut bag. You can kind of cut along the spine, along the top, and you can get your hand in there and push the guts kind of out of the way, and you can pull that tenderloin out. So if you just Google the gutless method on YouTube, you'll see how to pull the tenderloins out. So you get the tenderloins, you get the heart. You can, like he said, if you pull the entire rib cage off, then you can get at the liver pretty easily. The tongue, we keep the tongue sometimes we don't. If it's a big animal, I like to keep the tongue because by the time it keeps well in the wilderness because you're going to cut all this exterior part of the tongue off anyway. You boil it for a long time. It's a good piece of meat. It just takes a little prep. Pretty easy to do that. So it says, here you have one side of a moose, front and rear quarters, rib rack, and back strap removed from the carcass. You'll also need to remove the brisket, neck meat, and other meat left on the upward side of the carcass. So I always bring the neck meat out, and it's become one of my favorite cuts of every animal we kill because the neck meat has all that connective tissue, and when you slow cook it, there's just so many things you can do with it, and it can just fall apart and be tender. I like the neck meat, and there's a lot of neck meat on an ungulate, especially an elk. And so I always grab the neck meat. So you remove the neck meat, he says, which I agree with. I don't bother with the brisket very often, but if it's a moose, there's a lot to deal with. The brisket can be a little small on other animals. And then he says, now roll the animal over and repeat the process on the other side. And that's true. Like once I've gathered everything on that one side of the animal, okay, it's all clean because it's facing upward. Now I can roll the animal over, boom, and now I have the fur side facing up, and I just skin the hide down to the feet like I did the other side, and now I have a clean animal facing upward, and I repeat the process all over again. Okay? And then we have all the meat laying out on logs or hanging from trees or in game bags. If flies are out like spring bear, we put it right into a game bag and hang it in a cool shaded spot so the wind's blowing, the meat's cooling, no flies are getting on it to lay fly blow, and other things. So if there's no flies because it's colder, then we let it just kind of sit outside the bag during this whole process so it can get a little crust. When you take meat off the animal, okay, and it's hot, and you let it cool rapidly, it'll develop a crust on the outside, and that crust protects the meat. And when you get back and you butcher it, you're going to remove that crust. You might hang it in your garage for a week or two, let it age a little bit, and you cut that crust off, right? And now you have underneath it this fresh, clean piece of meat. Now, if you shoot a coos deer, that thing is the size of a big jackrabbit. Okay, so it's not a lot. And so if you were to let the meat get a crust, by the time you shave the crust off,
there's nothing left.
There's not much meat left. So that's something to always consider. Every cut you make on an animal, on meat, is a spot that will then be outward facing, can oxidize, get oxygen on it, and cause it to get a crust and be meat that you need to trim and throw away. Like with coos deer, I butchered it cleanly, and I'm like, okay, I don't want this to develop a crust. I let it cool for just a little bit. It's such a small animal, it cooled well anyway. But I wrapped it up in saran wrap, and I dropped it inside an ice cold cooler. And then that way it didn't get any crust on the outside. It was clean. And when I got home, I was able to leverage the entire piece of meat just the way it is. But I was also right next to a car and a cooler. When I'm up in the mountains, 20 miles in,
a little different.
It's different. And especially when the animal's bigger, like a moose, I don't care if it gets a crust on the outside. There's just so much meat on the inside, and I'm going to let it age for a while. Anyway, okay. Does that make sense, Brent?
Yep.
Yeah.
You want less circumference or
exposed to the air.
Yeah.
So that's a delicate decision when you're deciding, okay, I'm going to debone it. So on Brock's elk hunt that we published with Anthony this year, we decided, even though we were really remote in some gnarly country, we decided to pack that elk out on the bone because, as a butcher, Anthony's aware that the less deboning he does, the more he can do at home, the more meat he's able to save. Mm-hmm. Okay. But if you're in the bush and you're like, I'm way back here, I'm not packing these bones out, it's just me, I'm solo, you're going to try to debone the meat. So you kind of follow, when you have a hind quarter or a front shoulder, you kind of follow the muscle groups and you cut them off the bone. And it's not that hard. Find where the bone is, where the muscle group is, and you basically cut a slice all the way through to the bone, and then you just trim the bone out. right? And then the bone comes out, and now you have this cut. The more you can leave it all in one solid cut, the less waste you're going to have when you get home, because you're going to have less that has touched the air and been exposed, right? So I prefer, if I can, to leave it on the bone. If it's too heavy, then I cut it and I try to, so my hind quarter is really still one giant piece of meat connected.
Mm-hmm. You just try to get the bone out.
I just try to get the bone out. There are those that just start taking chunks, like round chunk here, round chunk there, a little chunk off
Which
that.
is what you would do at home when you're processing.
Yeah, but when you get back and you have a roast, and it's just been sitting out, and it's got hair on it, and it's got a little dirt on it, it's been exposed to the air, and you got to cut the whole side of it. You go from like, a squash sized piece to a sweet potato sized piece of meat, and it's like, I don't want that much waste. So generally what I do, if I'm going to remove the bone, is I just remove the bone, but try to leave the meat as, I try to limit as much waste as possible. And then once I've done that, I put it into the various game bags per cut, and then we pack it out. And then when I get home, I am able to, unpack the meat. During this whole process, I've tried really hard not to let hair and dirt and other things touch the meat, so it's extremely clean. Some cuts I'll hang for a little bit or let it sit and age. Others I get right away to butchering. Okay. But that's kind of how I do it. I basically try really hard to keep the meat extremely clean. And there's no need to gut the animal and open up that whole mess. You can avoid that. The other thing that you can avoid is, if you can stay away from the bladder and cutting open that kind of thing, the poop chute, all that, that's a whole tricky area. In here, in the book, it says evidence of sex. Most states require hunters to provide evidence of sex on big game animals until the animal has been processed and packaged. For horned or antlered big game, evidence of sex can include the head of the animal as long as it remains naturally attached to the carcass. Otherwise, the reproductive organs must remain naturally attached to one or both hindquarters in order for a hunter to meet evidence of sex requirements. And I guess the reason for that is because they're afraid you're going to shoot some big bull and then you're going to shoot a cow and call the cow meat because it's better meat, I guess. Or maybe you lost the bull because you didn't recover it fast enough, so you shoot a different sex animal. I guess it's just a way to keep people from...
Keeps them honest.
So you've got to leave the pecker and the nuts attached to one of the legs, one of the hindquarters, whatever. It's kind of a weird deal to me. If you've got, how many hunters are going to go through that deceptive move? I don't like keeping the pecker attached, but I don't like keeping it attached. I mean, in some sense, like, why can't I just keep
keep it, but
not attached? Yeah, but no, because then you might have just cut the balls and the head off of the animal, and then you shot a different one. It's a weird deal, but it is what it is, and that's fine. But when you're skinning the back end, you've got to keep the pecker attached to one of the legs generally. And that's the evidence that you need. So you kind of skin around that. So the hide comes off, but the pecker stays. Proof of sex, male. Carefully skin the penis and testicles during the gutting process. The skinned penis can be cut and removed at its base near the anus. Each testicle is attached to the muscle of the corresponding hindquarters with a small amount of connective tissue. Leave the testicles attached, being careful while working in this area during field butchering. So anyway, it's just one of those things. It's a pain in the butt. There are wanton waste laws out there. Hunters who are interested in filling the freezer shouldn't need to be convinced that it's worth saving neck roast, briskets, or flank meat. But hunters should be aware that most states have various laws mandating what portions of the animal must be retained. In Alaska, where the bull moose on page 16 was killed, strict wanton waste laws require hunters to pack out all edible meat.
Ugh.
Yeah. So there's some states where every scrap is required, like Alaska. And then there's states like, I believe, Colorado. It's the 4 quarters are required and the backstrap. The neck and the ribs, they weren't required years ago. I'm not sure. Again, you got to check all those laws. That's kind of the way we do it in a nutshell. I hope that is helpful. There's a ton of videos. This book goes into tabletop butchering. You can see in here, those that are watching the video, there's all kinds of diagrams that show you how to cut a rear leg, a front leg. So if you're a newish hunter, or you just haven't done any of the butchering yourself, you've always just taken a whole whitetail deer into a butcher shop and just said, hey, do this. It's really not that tough to do it yourself, and it's really rewarding. And you make sure you get the meat that you actually harvested and butchered in the field. A lot of times when you go to a butcher and you take your deer in, you're not getting your deer back, especially when you say, I want burger. And some of them in the past, I know they would have like 40 pounds or 50 pounds of meat in a grinder, and they dump a deer in, and you get what comes out. But at any given time, there's other people's meat in there. And so sometimes you're not even getting your deer, and a guy will get some deer that tastes like garbage, or something wrong with it, it's full of hair. And he'll be like, hey dude, what happened? And they're like, well, he's like, I went through all this care and I was very careful. There was nothing in my meat, and this tastes like butthole. What happened? And they're like, well, when you drop your meat off, you agree that, you may not be getting exactly your deer. You're just getting venison. And some will guarantee, some will not. And I'm not about that life. And, you pick up a grinder at Cabela's, it's not that much money. It's $150 or something. I think is the cheap one that we got. And to do tons and tons of burger, it's not ideal. It's still it's more of a professional version. I don't have the consumer grade model, but it's not that next level version that is like industrial, which I wish I had just spent the money on.
Yeah, I think it was like another $150 more.
Something.
And it was able to process like 3 times the amount of meat at once. And
what I end up doing nowadays is I cube my meat for the grinder, but I don't actually grind it all at once because it's a big job to just chuck it in the grinder. My grinder can't do that. So I split it up over the course of about once a month. I pull 3 or 4, 5 bags, some gallon bags out of the freezer that I've pre-butchered that are chunked. Then I take that, let it thaw out, and I take some bacon some of my favorite, or the bacon I like, and I use that as trim. And I just drop the burger in with some bacon, and I just grind it all up together and then I take that and I just throw it into some Ziplocs, and then I've got the burger for the month that we use.
Yeah.
And so it only takes me a Sunday evening or something, an hour or so to grind a bunch of meat up. I just do it as I go instead of pre-grinding everything. And it works out well because Suzanne likes to do a lot of Instapot and crock-pot recipes. She's always making some venison stews, and she takes those cubes and she just makes a venison stew out of it instead of burger. So it works out well because you never know, what do we feel like doing right now? And we have both options. And frankly, I just don't want to sit and spend 2 or 3 days grinding everything all at once. So
I remember us spending like 4 days processing that bear we shot from Prince of Wales in your basement.
We didn't know what we were doing. We really didn't know what we were doing.
And we had the small sausage grinder.
And it took us so much longer. And now I just cube it and can it. If it's bear meat, cube it and can it, so there's no risk of trichinosis.
I'm drooling thinking about some canned bear meat right now.
It is the best.
It is.
And the same thing is true here. We'll can the deer or the elk that we've cubed up. It's there for canning. It's there for stews and crockpot, and it's there for burger.
I gave my bishop one of those jars you gave me of bear meat, and he used that in the chili cook-off at church. Didn't tell anyone.
Yeah.
And he won, hands down.
That is the best meat, the shredded beef kind of pot roast.
Perfect pork or pot roast is what it is.
It's amazing. Anyway, I hope that's helpful, useful information for you guys. Like I said, you can get the book, the Meat Eater Cookbook, Stephen Rinella, Fish and Game Cookbook. It's a good one. I have a ton of cookbooks. I have all of Hank Shaw's books as well. They're a great resource.
What is it? It's Buck Moose. What's the other one?
It's
It's not duck, duck, goose, is it?
no, it's pheasant, quail, cottontail is another one. It's a small game, upland kind of, and then they're all catchy little titles, but they're really good. What I like about Hank Shaw's recipes is they're extremely easy. Like they're not, you don't have to have some degree in French baking or cooking in order to make them. Like some recipes are just, I'm like, I ain't doing that. That's a 12-hour cook job.
Yeah.
It's not practical.
Like seasonings you can't pronounce.
Yeah.
Hank Shaw, he's one of the reasons I got into hunting for mushrooms. He had a podcast that he did that I stumbled upon back when we were first starting Gritty.
Yeah.
And one of his first episodes was about going out and hunting mushrooms. I listened to that. He mentioned some books. I ordered one of the books, and before the books actually showed up, I went walking on a chunk of our property, and I ended up finding some. Remember those oyster mushrooms?
Yeah.
I pulled like 20 pounds of oyster mushrooms.
We had a lot of mushrooms out there. Yeah.
And I wouldn't have gone out there if I hadn't stumbled upon Hank Shaw's podcast.
Yeah. Good stuff. So check that out. If you got any more questions, feel free to leave us comments on the YouTube video. Ask questions there. We get to those. You can also reach out to us on Instagram. I'm good about that. I am not good about Facebook. I'm sorry. If you send me messages on Facebook, I probably won't look at them for a year.
That's being generous.
So I need to do better with Facebook, but that is not the place to reach out if you have questions. Instagram, and but mostly YouTube. Honestly, that's probably where we field the most questions and answer the most questions is on our YouTube channel. It's just the easiest way to interact. We sit down and we actually go through the questions in the comments, and we have our computer right there and we can type a response real quick. You can send us an email, but that might go the way of Facebook messages as well. So anyway, hope that's useful. Do us a favor, check out Sissy Sticks. Trekking poles every backpacker needs them. Get a pair from us. They're 15% off, plus they're already a steal to begin with. Because if you go to REI and you try to buy an equivalent, you're going to be into it a couple $100. And I think you can pick up a pair of Sissy Sticks for $115 and some change, which is a steal. It's a great deal. And they're carbon fiber uppers, aluminum lowers, and we've really tested them. We put them through the paces, and we know what works and what doesn't work. And these things work. They're tough. And there's new designs coming out all the time. Innovate, like we give them feedback and then they update them. They're just getting better and better. What you get right now for the money is a steal. So get yourself a pair of those. And also check out Seek Outside for 5% off Dynamic Q and Fiber shelters. I was talking about this the other day. I was saying the Silex is about $189, and that is a one-person shelter that weighs 1 pound 5 ounces, Brent.
Yep.
It's 1 pound 5 ounces.
And you use your trekking poles, thereby saving you some more weight.
Because
check out Sissy Sticks.
Because they are a trekking pole. The Silex is a trekking pole design. But you're talking about 1 pound 5 ounces. And if you get a stove with it, a U-turn stove, you're right around the same,
3 pounds, isn't it?
It's less than 3 pounds. It's quite a bit. It's 2.5 pounds or something. So you can get your Silex shelter, which is a nice, spacious shelter for you to have enough room for your stove, you and your gear. Or you could have no stove and fit 2 guys into it if you don't need a stove because it's September. But it's a game changer to have a stove. And the stove is so easy to put together and it's so nice. And if you do get rained on or something, you can dry out your gear. It's tough to beat. So for on a budget, you can pick up the stove, I think. Well, the tent is around $200. You get a stove jack, put in, it's a little more. It's like $215 or something. But then you throw a stove in there. I think the stove is, how much is the stove, Brent?
Depends on the size. But your small, medium, and large stove, I think they top out at $300.
So the U-turn stove is $299. I think the Cub is a little less. It's 23 ounces. So by the time you add 1 pound, 5 ounces, and then 23 ounces, that's your setup. It's a pretty killer deal. So check that out. And the last one is Graxaw game bags. As we're talking about meat and meat care, check those out. They're boneless meat bags. They're 6 ounces. for enough to put an entire elk.
They're reusable.
In. They're reusable. They're not puncture resistant.
Yeah,
but
no sharp bones.
No sharp bones, but Lampers and I have used them extensively all year long, and they're the game bag for us because they're smaller than a pop can when they're
They'll
condensed.
fit in the palm of your hand.
Fit in the palm of your hand, and they're only 6 ounces, and I just don't want the weight of anything else. So they kept the flies and everything off. They let the meat cool. They accomplished the needs of the job. So check that out. Support us by going out there and subscribing to the newsletter. Support us by using the code GRITTY at Mountain Ops to save if you got some orders and products you want to get Mountain Ops. And use the code GRITTY for your backcountry meals with Heather's Choice. You save 15% off there. And for you archers out there, use the code GRITTY for Valkyrie broadheads. Get yourself some Jagger or Blood Eagle broadheads. And do us a favor, stay gritty.